Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: Where the Dead Keep Secrets. The storm hit without warning. It was a late summer night, and the air had been warm, thick with humidity. The kind of night where even the crickets seemed to stop their song and the trees hung heavy in silence. But then, the wind picked up, carrying a chill that shouldn't have been there. The first raindrops came in a heavy, slashing wall, followed by the crack of thunder that rattled the windows of the old, crumbling house on the hill. Inside, Sarah sat alone in the dim light of a flickering lamp, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of an old photograph. The faces in the photo were blurred with age, but she knew them well. Her parents, long gone now. Her grandmother, too, who had died when Sarah was just a child, and her uncle, Peter, who had disappeared without a trace 2 years ago. The photo had been taken right before they all left the house, before the rumors began, before the stories of strange happenings in the old town cemetery. Her grandmother's house was always a place of mystery, a place she never quite understood. It was quiet, too quiet, with rooms that seemed to hold secrets in their shadows. The house on the hill had been abandoned when Sarah's parents died in a car accident, and now, it was hers to keep, or perhaps to suffer. She had never planned on coming back, but something had called her back. A feeling she couldn't ignore. And so, there she was, sitting alone in the very place that had always made her skin crawl. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling through the trees like something alive. Sarah set the photo down and reached for the glass of water beside her. But as her hand touched the cool glass, a soft knock echoed from the front door. It was a sound so soft, so almost imperceptible, that Sarah almost dismissed it. But then it came again, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected visitors. The road up to the house was long, treacherous, and nobody came up here at this hour unless they had a reason. Swallowing hard, Sarah stood and made her way to the door. Her feet felt heavy, the air in the house suddenly thick and suffocating. With each step, the knocking grew louder in her mind, like a drumbeat in the distance. When she reached the door, she hesitated. She could feel something pulling at her, something that told her not to open it. But her hand moved on its own, turning the handle, and the door creaked open. No one was there. But there, on the doorstep, was a small wooden box. The box was unremarkable, plain even, with no markings or writing on it, but it was warm to the touch, as if it had been left out in the sun all day. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Sarah knelt to pick it up, her fingers trembling. There was no note, no explanation, just the box. It was then that she felt it, the cold chill creeping over her, the kind of cold that comes not from the weather, but from something deep inside you. The feeling that you're being watched, that someone or something is waiting. She shut the door behind her, locking it tightly, though she knew it wouldn't help. The feeling followed her inside, a weight on her chest. The box sat on the table, staring at her with its silent, empty presence. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the house was eerily still. Sarah had done her best to ignore the box, to focus on other things, but the unease in her stomach only grew stronger the longer it sat there. It wasn't that she was afraid of the box itself. It was just wrong. Everything about it felt off. Her eyes kept drifting back to it as she tried to read, to do anything to distract herself. But the box, with its smooth, unblemished surface, seemed to pulse, if that made any sense. Almost like it was alive, like it was waiting for her to open it. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sarah gave in. She couldn't shake the pull of the box any longer. She stood, moved to the table, and picked it up. Her hands were still trembling, but she forced herself to sit down, to open it. The lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside was a pile of old, brittle paper, yellowed with age. She took a deep breath and reached for the top sheet, unfolding it carefully. It was a letter written in a familiar, looping script. The letter was addressed to her. But it was impossible. Her grandmother had been dead for years. She had no idea who could have written it. The letter began with a warning, its words like a chilling whisper in her mind. Sarah, if you are reading this, you have returned to the place where the dead keep their secrets. Your family, they knew the truth, but they kept it hidden. I have left this letter for you to find, because you are the last one who can set things right. The dead are restless, and they are waiting. Do not open the second box. If you do, you will never leave. The letter ended abruptly, with no signature. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the words. Her hands shook, the paper crinkling in her grip. What did it mean? The dead? Restless? What second box? There was no second box. But as she glanced around the room, her eyes were drawn to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to gather. There, almost hidden by the darkness, was another box. This one was different from the first. It was small, square, and covered in dust as though it had been there for years. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood, unable to take her eyes off it. It wasn't there before. It couldn't have been. Slowly, she walked toward it, her feet feeling like they were moving through mud. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with a presence that was almost suffocating. She reached out, and her fingers brushed against the box. The moment she touched it, the temperature in the room dropped. A rush of cold swept over her, so intense it made her skin prickle. The shadows seemed to writhe, and for a moment, she could have sworn the box moved, just a fraction. She pulled her hand back, but it was too late. The box had already opened. Inside, there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. And then, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like a breeze rustling the leaves outside, but then it grew louder, insistent, until the words began to form. You shouldn't have opened it, Sarah. A cold hand brushed against her shoulder. The storm outside howled louder than ever, but Sarah couldn't hear it. The whispering was too loud, too close. She turned around, but there was no one there. She was alone, but the air was thick with something that felt like a presence. A pressure. Something was with her, watching. The darkness in the box seemed to pull at her, like a black hole that wanted to swallow her whole. She could hear the faintest sound, like scratching, but there was nothing inside. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even more. She could see her breath in the air, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. You opened the door, the voice hissed. Her heart pounded. Her pulse raced. She stumbled backward, crashing into a chair, knocking it over. The box on the floor had stopped moving, but the room felt wrong. The shadows shifted again, stretching and twisting unnaturally, closing in on her. Then there was a knock at the door. The knock came again. This time, Sarah's pulse didn't just race, It surged with panic. She froze, her breath shallow, her heart a drum in her chest. The knock was so deliberate, so calm, as though whoever was on the other side of the door was certain that Sarah would answer. But she couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the shadows from the corners creeping forward, as if they too were waiting for something. She glanced at the box on the floor. Its open lid yawned at her, empty and dark, but the space around it felt thick with malice. The whispering had stopped for a moment, but the silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. Knock, knock, knock. The sound rattled her to her core. She glanced toward the window. The storm was worse now. Rain hammered against the glass in a relentless fury, but through the wet blur, she thought she saw something, no, someone, standing in the yard. It was a silhouette, dark and thin, barely visible against the swirling wind. Someone watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned back toward the door. The knocks had stopped. But now, a voice, low, familiar, whispered her name. Sarah? She felt it again. The cold, the pressure. It was as if the walls themselves were leaning in on her, pressing down, suffocating her. She wanted to run, to escape, but the house had already claimed her. She could feel it in every creaking floorboard and every cold gust of air that slithered through the cracks in the windows. Another whisper, this time sharper, more insistent. Sir, come to the door. There was no choice. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, with every nerve screaming at her to turn and flee, she walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, the air seemed to crackle with energy. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, and for a fleeting moment, she swore she could feel the pulse of something ancient beneath her touch, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for this moment. With a deep breath, she pulled the door open. But no one was there. The yard was empty. The rain poured down in sheets, the wind howling like a wild animal, but there was no figure standing in the yard. No shadow, no silhouette. Just the storm. But the moment Sarah stepped outside, something changed. The air turned thick, like a heavy blanket, and the world around her seemed to warp, as if the storm itself was a veil, hiding something just beyond her reach. She could see nothing but the rain, feel nothing but the cold on her skin. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl. It came from the ground beneath her feet, a rumble that made her stomach drop, like the earth itself was shifting, stretching. She looked down, and that's when she saw it, cracks, spider webbing out from the ground, stretching in all directions like a web of dark veins. The ground trembled. A deep, jagged crack split open the earth in front of her, wide enough to swallow her whole. It was a yawning void, black as the deepest night, and something was crawling out of it, slowly, deliberately, as if it were savoring the moment. Sarah stumbled back, heart hammering, but her feet felt glued to the ground. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. Something reached up from the darkness, a long, thin arm, pale and gnarled, like a tree root but wrong. The fingers were too long, too twisted. They reached for her, brushing against her ankle. She gasped, finally pulling herself free, but as she turned to run back to the house, the ground split open further. More hands emerged, more arms, clawing their way out of the earth. They were alive, Sarah realized, but not human. With a scream, she bolted back to the door, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against it, breathless, shaking. But it wasn't over. The whispering started again, louder now, frantic, desperate. "You shouldn't have come back, Sarah." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The walls of the house seemed to twist and bend, and the shadows moved with a life of their own. She was no longer alone. The boxes, the ones she had found earlier, sat on the table, their dark, empty spaces staring back at her. And then, something shifted in the corner of her vision. A figure, tall, pale, and thin, like the creature she had seen earlier in the yard. It stood motionless, its eyes hollow and black, its grin stretched impossibly wide. "Come," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers combined into one. "Come closer. You know what we need." Sarah took a step back, but the figure moved with her, its gaze never leaving her face. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air was thick with tension. She stumbled backward, her hand knocking into the table. The second box, still sitting there, shifted slightly, as if something inside it was moving. The creature smiled wider. "Open it," it whispered. But Sarah couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to touch it again. Not after the letter, not after everything she had seen. The voice of the creature, however, became louder, more commanding. "Open it," it hissed again. Sarah turned away from the table, looking toward the door. She had to get out of there. She had to leave before it was too late. But when she reached the door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, but she had never locked it. She twisted the handle again, and then the world around her seemed to tilt, to twist, as if she were falling. Falling into nothingness. She screamed. The creature was behind her now, its fingers cold and dry, brushing against her back. Its voice was no longer a whisper. It was loud, deafening. "You opened the door, Sarah. Now you must come with me." And then, as the darkness closed in, Sarah felt herself being pulled backward, toward the center of the room, toward the very spot where the ground had cracked open outside. She fought against it, but her body felt weightless, as though the very air had turned to lead. The last thing she heard was the creature's voice, low and triumphant. "Where the dead keep their secrets, Sarah, there is no escape." If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.